Welcome to Experience Talks, the radio magazine for the experienced listener. I'm Cynthia Friedlob. This show is from our Experience Talks 2012 archives. Lawrence Ferlinghetti is a poet, painter, civic activist, and the co-founder of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers. He is the author of poetry, translations, fiction, theater, art criticism, and film narration. He's best known for his iconic book of poems, A Coney Island of the Mind, a collection that's been translated into 9 languages with sales of over 1 million copies. Tim Carpenter talked to Lawrence Ferlinghetti about his new book, Time of Useful Consciousness, and the poetry of a life well lived.
So, Lawrence, your new book of poetry is called Time of Useful Consciousness. What inspired you to write this one?
Well, the phrase time of useful consciousness comes from, it's an aeronautical term meaning the time from when you're deprived of oxygen until you pass out. It's a short time when you still have time to do something to save yourself. So applying this more or less to the world situation, that's what the book is about.
So the phrase that the title is and how that applies to the world at large right now, how do you see it? Obviously, this is an interesting time to be living.
Well, it's obviously ecologically and politically that we're at the tipping point of our civilization. The most advanced climate scientists are questioning whether our civilization can even survive this century. And then besides the ecological tipping point, the political situation is like the world is about to explode.
I want to talk a bit about your childhood. You had a rather unconventional childhood, am I right?
No, I don't know. Everyone's childhood is unconventional.
Very true. You were raised by, I think, the family that founded Sarah Lawrence College, correct?
That's right. I lived in a mansion a half a mile away from the campus. Say, why don't we get on to the poem? I have so much to say about the poem. Why waste time on the trivial details of my existence?
Very good. Okay, let's actually, Lawrence, do you have a copy of the book in front of you? I'd love to have you read a brief passage from it to get us started.
This is a book. It's the second of the America series. America's Book 1 was published by New Directions about 5 or 6 years ago, and this is America's Book 2, and it begins. The first book began in Europe and ended in New York, ended with the assassination of Kennedy. This book begins on the East Coast and follows the sweep of migrations westward, especially after the Second World War. So I can read you the opening passage.
Terrific.
In that time of useful consciousness, in that hinter nation that stretches westward from Manhattan, autumn finds the people restless across the iron cities, cement plains, and silted rivers, across Appalachia, across Ohio, first western frontier, and down into it, down into Middle America, into America, by Great Lakes yearning, by firelands burning, red brick mansions moldering down the wooded streets of 100 winded towns, under the huge sugar maples, down the canyons of dying leaves, each a hand letting go in the full catastrophe, in the full miracle of life.
You mentioned World War II, Kennedy moving westward. You fought in World War II, and I know that experience had a profound effect on you and your view of war. Obviously, we're in a time of war now. How did that experience identify with you? How did you recover from that, and how did it affect your outlook on politics?
I didn't recover. I moved in the Second World War. I was never injured in the war. I was a skipper of a subchaser in the Normandy invasion. But we didn't land. We were 2 miles offshore the anti-submarine screen. And we were watching the poor doughboys getting shot up on the beaches through our binoculars, but we were nice and high and dry. The Luftwaffe was passing over, dropping bombs, but nothing dropped near us. It was all too high and too far away for us to shoot at. And I had a guardian angel the whole war. Nothing ever came near us.
I know that you also witnessed, though, the aftermath of the bomb, and I know that had a profound effect on you. What was that like, and what was the effect?
I was in the last year of the war. I was a navigator on a troop transport. We started across the Pacific as part of a invasion force of Japan. By the time we got to Japan, it had been the atomic bomb had been dropped, and we were converted into an occupation force, and we went into southern Kyushu. And one day when we were allowed shore leave, we went by train to Nagasaki, which was several hours away. We walked among the cleaned up ruins of what was Nagasaki and saw the mulch, 3 square miles of mulch with bones and hair and eyes sticking out. And it was a total wasteland, a moonscape, and made me an instant pacifist.
And how that relates to time of useful consciousness, this takes off, as you mentioned, where the first one stopped. Does that moment in time play into what you're trying to say? You mentioned that it comments on how the world is now and where we're headed. Did that have an effect on how you write poems, especially from your political perspective, based on that?
I don't think so. I was pretty much the American Boy Scout all during the war. And it wasn't until I got to San Francisco. Well, I remember I was in New York going to Columbia Graduate School before I went to Europe on the GI Bill. And then when I was at Columbia University in New York, I had a girlfriend in the village. And I used to go visit her, and I would see these strange magazines on her table, like The Nation magazine, The New Republic, which was a leftist magazine then. I'm talking about the 1946. Masses and mainstream communist magazine publications, and a few others like that, and I had no idea what these were. It turned out my girlfriend's brother was a member of the Communist Party. That was my first contact with the left in this country. In fact, on the East Coast, I never heard of conscious objectors, and I rushed right into the armed services like all good boys. In 1941, it became, that's what it was socially acceptable to do. I never heard of conscious objectors. So only when I got to San Francisco that I was got my real political awakening, and I must say it was through Pacifica Radio, KPFA, and especially the programs of the book programs of Kenneth Rexroth, who was, I'm talking about now, I arrived in San Francisco in 1951. And Rex Roth was the reigning deity in all things radically poetic. He was a leading critic. He was published and leading poet, the most important one in San Francisco, sort of the pater familias for younger poets. He was published by New Directions, which was the highest ideal you could achieve in the poetry world in 1951. And listening to him, his books program on KPFA, that was a real enlightenment. There were other programs on there, for instance, Alan Watts, and that was the days before. That was the, shall we say, quote, the good old days at KPFA, before identity politics destroyed the station, and it's been putting itself back together again ever since.
And did you know and get to know Lou Hill back in the old Pacifica days?
I used to hear him on the radio, but I never actually met him.
And you mentioned all things radically poetic. I think an argument could be made that you became one of those people who was all things radically poetic, and you founded City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco in the 50s. What was the impetus behind creating that place?
I didn't consider myself radically poetic. I arrived at one of Kenneth Rexroth's Friday night, what he called his soirees, where poets and other flickering literary lights would show up, loaded in more ways than one, usually loaded with lots of poetry. And I was a new arrival from New York and totally straight, and had no idea what the strange sweet smell that drifted through the air might have been. It seemed to be some kind of a leaf that people burned and smoked. And I just sat in the back. I didn't dare open my mouth to hear some of these poets who were really quite brilliant conversationalists, like Robert Duncan and Philip Lamantia. Philip Lamantia's collected poems are just going to the press at University of California Press. I just wrote a small preface for it, describing the scene at Rexroth's Friday night soirees and listening to Duncan and Philip Lamantia and their stream of consciousness conversation. They were brilliant conversationalists. They were totally associative. So a sentence could start off with something about Foucault's pendulum and move on to a discussion of the size of Flaubert's, and then with a general disquisition on the meaning of phallic symbols, etc. That kind of conversation flew over my head while I was what I thought I was still a youngster listening to all this. A youngster, I was only 31.
And there are a lot of other youngsters around that time when
the beats started arriving. You know, those wild-ass carpetbaggers from back east who proceeded to take over the scene.
It's funny you mentioned the beats, because I know that's not exactly a term that you've ever identified with much, but what was that time like, and why did those...
Well, I got identified with the beats by publishing them.
Right.
Beginning with Kenneth Rexroth himself, who certainly was an elder beat, and Kenneth Patchen, who's more or less forgotten these days, who was a radical pacifist poet, and then Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which was the fourth one in the Pocket Poet series published by City Lights in 1950. 5.
And I'm wondering what it was like to go through the experience with Ginsberg and be involved in the obscenity trial that came out of Ginsberg's reading of the poem Howl at City Lights.
Did you say the insanity trial?
The obscenity trial. The obscenity trial. But yes, I think it could be called insanity trial just as well, I would imagine, right?
Well, Alan was quite mad, but in a surprisingly sane manner. And Allen Ginsberg was the PR master. Allen Ginsberg was not only a great poet, he's a great publicist. And if it hadn't been for Allen Ginsberg, the Beat generation as such would never have been recognized as a group, but merely as separate great writers on the landscape.
And when you first saw Howl, what did you see in it that sparked your interest to publish it?
Are you kidding? Did you read it?
I love it. I'm just wondering what your impression was when you saw it.
Well, I don't know whether I loved it or not, but I'd never seen the world in that way before, which is the way it is with great works. When you read them, the author shows you the world or shows reality in a way you've never seen before.
And I know Kerouac came a little bit after that, but I know Kerouac is going to have another coming of age here. There's a film version of On the Road coming out soon. What was Kerouac like?
What do you mean coming of age?
He's going to have, I think, a younger audience rediscover him because of the film coming out. So
I didn't know he'd been forgotten.
So what was Kerouac like? What was it like to be around him in those days?
I wasn't around him very much, and he didn't live here very long. He lived down by the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks in a 3rd or 4th class hotel while he was a railroad brakeman on the run to San Jose. But he didn't, as far as I know, he never lived in North Beach, which is where City Lights bookstore is. And it wasn't until years later he came to City Lights, probably in the late 50s, early 60s. But I didn't get to know him except passing by. I wasn't one of the in group in the original Beats consisted of Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Peter Orlovsky, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs. And then there were dozens of others who became associated with it, all kinds of other poets like Leroy Jones, Amory Baraka, that is, and many others like Diane Di Prima, who was in from the beginning. She was practically the lone woman in the original Beat group. She lives in San Francisco now. She was the 2nd or 3rd poet laureate of San Francisco a few years back. But Jack was always, after On the Road was published, he didn't hang around with the Beats. He didn't go on the road with the Beats. He went home to take care of his mother. His French-Canadian mother, he moved about the country from Lowell, Mass, where he grew up, to I forget the town in Long Island. Then he ended up several times in Florida. That's where he died. He was always taking care of his mother, and he didn't go on the road. He didn't hang out with the Beats, and he became more and more rightist politically. His last books are really shockingly reactionary and even, worse than reactionary isn't pejorative enough for his very last works.
Your book, Coney Island of the Mind, I wanted to talk about. It obviously had a profound effect on many people. It's the best-selling book of poetry ever, I believe. What was your inspiration in writing that book? And especially, what's it like now knowing that it touched that many people?
Well, most of those poems came out of my years in Europe when I was a student at the Sorbonne for 4 years and got a doctorate, mostly by writing my thesis in the back of cafes. And the poems are heavily influenced by the French surrealists and people like Apollinaire, and it was a general collection of little epitomes of the living that came to my head while I was still in Paris or in my first years in San Francisco. And the book was published after I'd been in San Francisco 7 years. It was published in 1958 by New Directions. And it was one of the first paperbacks.
So the new book, The Time of Useful Consciousness, you've been Poet Laureate of San Francisco. You're a creator in every sense of the word. What does the power of art and creativity mean to us as humans? And a book like, you're talking about useful consciousness, what can that do for us? What can poetry and art and the types of things that you've pursued in your life do for us at a time like this?
Well, the best I can do is write this book. These days, poetry has to be able to meet the challenge of apocalyptic times, even if it means sounding apocalyptic.
Do you think that apocalyptic is where we're headed? We're obviously in a pretty nasty election year right now. Is there hope ahead, in your viewpoint?
Definitely. Run for the woods.
There's hope in the woods. Lawrence, I know you're a painter. Do you prefer painting or poetry these days as an artist?
Well, I don't prefer one over the other, really. It's a matter of which comes to hand at any particular moment. I'd like to read the notes at the end of the book of Time of Useful Consciousness, just to give the listener an idea of what the whole book really is about.
Fantastic.
These are the notes on the very last page. Time of Useful Consciousness, a fragmented recording of the American stream of consciousness in the tradition of William Carlos Williams Patterson, Charles Olson's Maximus, Allen Ginsberg's Fall of America, and Ed Sanders' America, A History in Verse. Time of Useful Consciousness, an aeronautical term denoting the time between when one loses oxygen, when one passes out, etc. Oh, the phrase is used as the call letters of TUC Radio, an FM broadcaster produced by former KPFA Pacifica Radio staffer Maria Gallardon. And she should be given credit.
So, and is that...
Tune into TUC Radio.
So, what is your hope that this book brings about? What's the purpose here?
That it sells 1 million copies, and I can rest assured that 1 million people read it. I don't care so much about making $1 million on it as that it gets read.
Fantastic. Lawrence, one question. As you've gotten older, has your process as a writer changed?
You know, in art criticism and in literary criticism these days, there's always emphasis on the process. In painting, it's the same thing in art criticism as in literary criticism. Do you brush your teeth before you start painting? That kind of thing. It's completely irrelevant. I'd like to read instead the very last passage, because the book really is very, it puts out a very dim view of the future. I mean, it quotes Günter Grass, whom I met years ago, and he told me that he saw the future of the 21st century being, in the later 21st century, that the nations as we know them will no longer exist, and the world will be swept with ethnic hordes in search of food and shelter. And that's about as apocalyptic a view as you can hear these days. And so toward the end of the book, I get to this point and I say, enough already. And I turn to what's known as what I call the lyric escape. So you can read some beautiful lyric poetry to yourself. You can sing beautiful lyric songs, non-political, etc. And it's the lyric escape. And so the very last stanza of this poem is, Walt Whitman, you should be living at this hour, optimist of humanity en masse. Oh, graybeard, old Walt, stepping off Brooklyn Ferry into the heart of America. You who contain multitudes, you who heard America singing, you who sounded your barbaric yelp over the roofs of the world, you who said, I'll whimper up no more, one out of the closet, endlessly rocking, you who struck up for a new world, solitary, singing in the West. Where away now, dear poet, dear lover, eternal yea-sayer? That's the end of the book. Well, thank you very much.
Lawrence Ferlinghetti, congratulations on Time of Useful Consciousness, and thanks for being on Experience Talks. We appreciate it.
And that's our show. You can get more information about any of our guests and listen to previous shows on our website at experiencetalks.org. Experience Talks is produced by the nonprofit Engage, catalyzing the art of active aging. Thanks to the production staff at KPFK Radio, and thanks to you for listening.